I'd like to welcome you all back for our final closing session, and after I finish my remarks, welcome any of you who would like to, and anyone who's online. We have about 18, 20 people all told present. This has been a discussion about accomplishment, how we as a society accomplish, and particularly our focus has been on what is the role of an individual in accomplishment. In my opening remarks, I put up a slide that said that accomplishment seems to be the result of a combination of factors. There's the role of the individual we've been focusing on. There's the role of the society. There's the role of social organizations, whether it's a business or government or bank or whatever Federal Reserve or whatever it may be. There's the role of the environment, the physical environment. If we're fortunate enough to grow up in Silicon Valley in the 1970s, that helps if you want to start a PC company and if you want to learn everything about an emerging technology. And there's this other factor which we really don't understand and certainly don't know how to explain or quantify, but there is some other element there that we're calling life, whether it's a question of luck or chance or serendipity or yin-yang balance or karma or whatever it is. There's something there which goes into the pot as the spice that seems to be a determinate factor, at least in some cases. Growing up in America, I think I was imbibed with the typical American view that our accomplishment depends entirely on the individual. It was only many years later, maybe only after I moved to India and saw a society that was in an earlier stage of economic and social development, and seeing how much was missing of the infrastructure that I had grown up with and taken for granted, that it helped me get the education, do anything I wanted to do. I remember in the 70s there wasn't even a yellow pages in what we call a classified yellow pages, and when we had an electric typewriter at that time. There was no electronics, and I brought it over from the U.S. and we were using it, and it broke, and I wanted to find a way to get it repaired. And we asked in Pondicherry, nobody knew what to do with it. I sent somebody to Madras, they were going from shop to shop, nobody knew what to do. Finally, I happened to go to the British Library for some books, and I saw that they had 3 electric typewriters there. I said, what do you do when they break? And they pulled out a little card, and they said, there's this little shop down in the heart of the town, and he knows how to repair them. I said, why don't we have a yellow pages here? Why complicate matters? It made me aware of how much my accomplishments in growing up and the accomplishments of many of my friends, colleagues, businesses, and everything, things we thought we were doing ourselves, were really possible because of the society we were working in, because of the level of the development of that society. And the more we thought of it, the more I realized I can't do anything I can't communicate with you without using an inherited possession called language, which we share together. All our tools, instruments, very concepts, our definitions, our ways of thinking are things we have inherited. And that largely, I think, coming from one extreme, that of the American view where society almost doesn't seem to exist. It's the individual who accomplishes, which of course is a perception. I would even say it's a social construction. It's the way we look at reality, and that puts maximum responsibility on the individual. It also gives him maximum sense of that his destiny is in his own hands. But it's never the truth in any absolute sense. We are always part of something bigger. I've seen entrepreneurs who earned money and said, why should I pay taxes? I did all of this work. After all, what did I get from the government? What did they do for me? They're just taking my money. said, well, you say that, but how do you get your goods out of the factory and onto the out to the port or out to the airport where you're shipping them to somebody? Are you using roads? Did you pay for those roads? Who protects your facilities from theft, from fire if you have one? And I knew we had one client who had a $100 million facility burned down. Who's responsible for all of those things? Are you at all aware? What's the protection you have if somebody sells you a substandard product, and so forth and so on and so on? So according to our mindset, according to our social construct, we tend to see this complex thing called accomplishment from different angles and different perspectives. When I went to India, the contrast was very striking for me, because when I talked to a lot of people about accomplishment, they would say, well, the government has to do it for me. We can't do anything because the government hasn't done this or the government doesn't have that. It was a completely different construct. What's the government got to do? What are you doing? What are you doing for yourself? Why do you bother about that? It's a different construct. It was a different portion. We know that our whole economic theory, almost it looks incredible to us today, but we now know very clearly in retrospect that we've been running on an economic theory for 200 years that completely ignored the fact of nature. We completely ignored the fact that we're pumping out non-renewable resources, squandering them, and they don't come into the balance sheet at all. Nature's not part of our balance sheet. I made a profit this year. How did you make it? I exhausted about 1 million years worth of petroleum buried in my property for 1 year's profit, and I'm very productive. What about nature? What was her contribution to this? And if you're not doing it next year, it's because you haven't taken that into account. The great commercial revolution started in Europe, the commercial revolution that became the basis for the Renaissance, which Alberto was talking about yesterday. One of the critical breakthroughs that came that made it possible was the Italians invented something called double-entry bookkeeping. And it sounds so silly and trivial, but the fact was, if you've ever tried keeping accounts without double-entry bookkeeping, you would know. You can keep an inventory of how much is there. It's almost impossible to know whether you've made money or not. And unfortunately, I've had a number of clients who said, I don't know, when my bank has told me I'm going bankrupt. And I said, how can I be going bankrupt? My sales keep going up. Yes, your sales keep going up. You're selling more. But the question is, what's happening to your costs? And your unit of sale for each of those marginal things that you're... So something we take for, every business takes for granted is a gift because some genius of Renaissance Italy discovered and thought of a new mechanism for double-entry bookkeeping based on this ingenious device of the Hindu numerals and the decimal place and the zero, and all of this is what we work with. But according to our social construction of reality, they may not come into the picture at all in our balance sheet. Why should I pay taxes? What have I got? What's anybody done for me? I've had to do everything for myself. So we all have our own social constructions. That's pretty clear and pretty easy to illustrate from the point of view of society. That's pretty easy to illustrate today from the point of view of environment, though it wasn't always that way. And now Janani has raised put this other elephant on the table, which I don't know about you, but I certainly feel blind when I'm trying to figure out what this thing is called life. And then we say, as we do, as I did as I was growing up, life is it's the things that have no causality. It's the things that happen according to chance. Well, the question that came up in my mind, the more I read of other views, the more I read of those who have accomplished at a high level, the more I understand of other cultural perspectives, which don't look at life the way we did when we were growing up, or the way the Western scientific mentality did when it grows up, I began to ask myself, is my view of life a social construction? I've been taught not to see life. I've been taught not to take note of things because it doesn't fit any of my rational explanations. It doesn't fit into a scientific paradigm. And I suspect that many of the things we believe today scientifically, there was a time when we didn't even take note of them because we didn't have any conceptions by which we could explain them. So I was happy that Janani made this presentation, not to give answers, but to bring this up and put it in front of us and say, is it because there really is nothing but chance? And if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, what is chance? And what is the probability? I mean, chance to me is you flip a coin 50 times or 100 times and you expect it to come up 50-50 or 48-52 or something like that. But when something that happens like once in a million years, so improbable, is chance really an explanation? Or are there other explanations? That led me to be interested in finding out what other societies have said about this, who view it in a different way. I was particularly curious when I read high achievers who said, luck has nothing to do with this. They can't explain it. They haven't mapped out a science to explain it, but their own gut feeling was that, of what? I come back to the comment I made this morning about the Cartesian dichotomy. Descartes really cut us off, cut the world into two pieces. There's everything out there and there's everything in here. And if you see the social sciences today, of course psychology is the exception, but I don't know that there should be any exception. Our social sciences tend to focus entirely on the outer world of society as if it's unrelated to the psychological world, the subjective world of the individual. When Alberto, what he talked about the placebo effect was absolutely fascinating to me, and I've read a lot about it because and I was really eager to know what does the medical profession think about this? How are they dealing with it? Or are they simply to a large extent saying, I don't see it. I don't see it because it doesn't fit into my reductionist mechanical paradigm. So I thought it's worth putting it on the table because it is a factor, leaving us free to draw our own conclusions and our observations as Janani has invited us to do. My own experience is, and I'm not talking scientifically and I'm not trying to put anything across as a body of knowledge, we can say the sharing of scientific experience is over and we're just talking informally as friends. But I agree, my own experience tallies with that of those who have accomplished a far, far higher level than I could ever hope to. That what happens to me in my life is in some way, which I don't fully understand, related to what I am inside. Not only related to my behaviors, but even related to my thoughts and my feelings. Living in India, I found as a great gift, because for them, this is common ABC. This is taken for granted. Every person growing up in a village believes or knows this, and they see it all the time. They see things that I never noticed, because they're used to looking at life in a different way than I do. So I thought it's worth putting it up so that we can think about it. Science has uncovered many of the links and causal relationships between the different parts, levels, and dimensions of the living organization on Earth, of us as individuals, as society, as physical nature, as the ecology we live in. And when it comes to human life, there's much that still defies explanation by science today. There's still much that we don't know. Janani mentioned gravity, which is a good example. We've got theories to explain gravity. But if you take the theory of the quantum The quantum theory of gravity is that gravity is caused by an exchange of particles. The relativity theory of gravity of Einstein is that gravity is caused because space is curved by the mass. It curves the mass around it. They're two totally unrelated theories to explain the same phenomenon. The only thing we know for sure is gravity is there and it works, and if I jump off the cliff, I don't have to worry about what day of the week it is or what time of night or day. I know what's going to happen. So gravity is real. But why it happens, we got two theories, and maybe there are several other possibilities that would be adequate. So there are unresolved contradictions, even at the physical level. I gave the example this morning that some of the greatest discoveries of science have been by reconciling things that seem to be apparently unrelated, like magnetism and electricity, which were thought to be unrelated phenomena, like inertia and motion. So we know that we don't know so much. We know that we live in a world where we're handicapped in many respects with all the knowledge and science that we have. So it's worth being open to looking, to trying to understand phenomenon that we haven't tried to study up until now. So what is life? Historical events, biography, the testimony of high achievers, the writings of great authors and great thinkers. By the way, the example that Giannini gave from Hamlet was very striking to me because I first drove my attention to it. The most famous literary critic of Shakespeare was A.C. Bradley. He was an Oxford professor who lived early in the 20th century. And Bradley was so profound in his psychological insight into the characters in Shakespearean tragedies that you felt reading Bradley was as good as reading Shakespeare. He was so profound, and if anyone has the opportunity, I would recommend it. There was only one point in a 400-page book where I was really disappointed with him, and that was when he referred to this incident. Because he pointed it out. He said, here, Shakespeare needed to get Hamlet back to Denmark, and he invented this crazy apparatus of a pirate ship, and the most ridiculous, improbable event of a pirate ship coming in the middle of the night and him jumping on it and ending up coming back. And I said, come on, the man who wrote these 37 plays and created characters like Shakespeare and speeches like the one from Henry V we heard yesterday, you mean to say that if he wanted to get Hamlet back to Denmark, that he couldn't find a more plausible, reasonable, believable way to do it? And then, when I started reading other literature, I found exactly what Giannini said, that all the great literature is filled with these things. Why? Why is it unless the writers are seeing something that we as scientists, we in our rational mode, can't explain and are not really even trying to explain because we've explained it away, we've called it chance. This idea that there may be a relationship between our consciousness and the world of matter around us, of course, has gained a lot more plausibility in the last century since the discovery of quantum theory, since the development of quantum theory and the role of consciousness and the action of consciousness even on subatomic particles. Actually, I've been very curious about this, and quantum theory is quoted very widely to support this view, but I think if you really talk to the physicists, you'll see there's quite a bit of controversy about this. There are certain interpretations of quantum theory which insist that consciousness is really the causal factor, and there are certain interpretations where they've tried to explain it in a different way, by a different construct that is consistent with the facts. The one that supports this view is Newman-Wigner interpretation. It's part of the Copenhagen interpretation. We may not be able to explain, we cannot explain today of an action of consciousness on subatomic particles. We can't explain what they call in quantum theory non-locality. This action at a distance that bothered Einstein so much that he said it couldn't really exist. But I don't know of any physicist who denies the reality of this phenomenon of non-locality. We just don't have a construct that's consistent with it. So the question I'm raising is there a relationship between our subjective inner reality and objective outer reality that goes beyond? Obviously there is. Alberto's telling us all the time, if you behave in this way, you're going to get this kind of responses from the world around you, and that makes sense. If you think this way and you behave this way and you have attitudes like that, you're going to attract responses like that. There is obviously a relationship between the inner and the outer, between the objective and the subjective. The question is, what are the boundaries of that relationship? Is it strictly according to our behavior? Well, Alberto tells us it depends on your social construction of knowledge, too. The same thing you hear from somebody, the same event you see, and according to the way you perceive it, you understand and respond in a different way. This is an important topic for us next week, because if we're really looking at a transdisciplinary science of psychology, of society, we're going to have to find a way to reconcile the objective and the subjective reality much more effectively than social science as a whole has done till now. I quote Shakespeare here from Hamlet, there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. It is not in the stars to hold our destiny, but in ourselves. Clearly he's talking about an inner-outer relationship. So I thought of ending now, not on a scientific note, but what I promised in the beginning of this course to try to say, is there something practical we can take home from this that we can use in some way or another? And I just thought of sharing from my own experiences what I think are some practical applications of the things we've been discussing that can be useful for the purpose of accomplishment. Whether or not we understand how they work, we can try using them and see the results that we get from it. And all the things I'm talking about here I've used in my consulting practice, I've advised to my clients, and many of them have seen them effective in their own life. But how they work or why they work, I'm not going into that. I think the first of these is so obvious, and we've said it, but just for the sake of being comprehensive, because this has been a great personal learning for me, that every experience we have, whether it's positive or negative, has a knowledge to offer us. We tend to, I had a bad experience, let me forget it. I had a good experience, let me enjoy it. But there's as much I can learn from every bad experience as I can from every good experience. How far am I really extracting the knowledge that life is offering me at every moment? And a quote from Alan Watts, what is discord at one level of your being is harmony at another level of his being. What of our being? What does it mean? How can it be? How can we reconcile these two? So I was thinking back to some of the experiences we've been talking about. And Alberto asked me yesterday about George Washington and, what was his story and any way you can explain. And so I mentioned the fact that Washington was rejected by the British Army and treated as a second-class citizen. I don't think that fully explains Washington. His heroism and his idealism and his self-sacrifice is not just a vengeance against the British, but certainly at a particular point in life, it turned out to be a very important experience. And if he hadn't been rejected by the British, I could have seen that he might have been fighting on the other side in the American Revolution and been one of the generals of on the British Army. Michael Blumenthal, one of my management associates, who interviewed a lot of high achievers, he interviewed this Michael Blumenthal, who became the Secretary of the Treasury, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury. Before that, he was the president of Sperry Univac. Blumenthal grew up, his parents were living in China at the time, and he ended up in a concentration camp in Shanghai. And he said, 50 years later in his life, that it was the experiences he had in the concentration camp in Shanghai that enabled him to rise as high as he did. I don't know how many of you have seen Empire of the Sun, the Spielberg movie, which is another story of an English boy who got trapped in a Japanese concentration camp in China during World War II, and what was the tremendous experience he had in trying to survive. Steve Jobs already mentioned it. He said that being rejected by Apple was a critical learning experience for him, essential for what came later. We talked about this earlier, about the power of aspiration, that aspiration releases energy and powerfully attracts what we seek. I wrote a novel by the name The Book, and in the novel, it's a fictitious story, but in the novel, one of my heroes of the story goes into Moe's bookstore and is browsing around, and suddenly a book falls from the top shelf and onto his lap, and he takes it home out of curiosity because he couldn't figure out how that happened, and it becomes the plot, it opens up the plot of the story. This was my own experience. I ended up in India because a book fell off the top shelf of Moe's bookstore in 1970, and to completely change the course of my life. My understanding, I can't prove it, I can't document it, but my understanding, that book was exactly what I was looking for in life, and I didn't know it existed, and I didn't know where to look for it. And so when Janani says, when you really seek something, that it comes to you, that rings true to me because I've had that experience. I'm sure Alberto can tell us much more about this phenomenon called the Pygmalion Effect. I was quite interested in it from the point of view of business consulting. And if you're familiar with it, the idea, you know the story of My Fair Lady and Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, when Professor Higgins takes this flower girl, Eliza Doolittle, and converts her, educates her, and gives her so much that she's mistaken by the Hungarian expert as a princess of the royal blood. This Shaw's story, which is an ancient Greek myth as well, has been used by psychologists to talk about the effect of what happens when we give positive attention to somebody. And there was a study done, there was one study done in San Francisco by a group of psychologists. They went into an elementary school and they told the principal that they have developed a foolproof test to identify late bloomers. A late bloomer is a young child who's performing poorly, but really has tremendous innate capacity. And of course, any teacher would like to know who's performing poorly simply because they're substandard in their intelligence and in their capacity, and who's performing poorly simply because of adjustment problems or something and really has a greater potential. So the principal agreed that he'd be very interested to see the results. So they administered this test to a large number of students, and they took them back home to evaluate them, and they threw the tests papers away. And they randomly assigned scores to the students. And they went back and told the principal, here is the list of the late bloomers in your class. And the principal informed the teachers. And they came back a year later to measure the performance improvement of these students in their academic life, and who were the students who had improved the most. They were the ones that the teacher had been told are late bloomers with a lot of hidden potential. That's the Pygmalion effect. That's the power of human attention. And I think we all know that, whether you're in a management position or in psychology or in teaching, whatever it is, our capacity to attend on another person is a tremendous energizing power. I'm saying when we use it positively, in a positive sense. And there's an inverse to that. The more we concentrate on problems, the more the problems tend to grow. That's the hypochondriac who's watching for every little symptom and concentrating on it. We energize the problem by concentrating on it. So concentrating on the positive and giving minimum attention to the other side is a strategy I have seen very effective for accomplishment. The power of attitude, every motivational course, every marketing course, every management course, and every course in psychology that wants to motivate human beings to better performance knows and has to talk about the power of attitude. I had some quotes here which I like from Shakespeare. Our doubts are traitors and make us lose the good we oft might win by fearing to attempt. A fear, an attitude, a doubt makes us miss an opportunity. The greatest discovery of my generation, William James, is that a human being can alter his life by altering his attitudes. Churchill, attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference. Thomas Jefferson, nothing can stop the man with the right mental attitude from achieving his goal. Nothing on earth can help the man with the wrong mental attitude. So, this is obvious. We all know this. We use this. But what are they saying? They're all saying that my attitude determines what's going to happen out there, not just how much money I have or how much support I get and how much cooperation I get from other people. And this is from an American baseball player. I like the quote. I'm not a baseball fan particularly, but a positive attitude causes a chain reaction of positive thoughts, events, and outcomes. It's a catalyst and it sparks extraordinary results. And I think if you polled 1,000 professional athletes who are really successful, they would all endorse something similar. We all know it, but it does relate to this issue. There was a book recently written called Give and Take, which was trying to document a very simple thesis that people who give more to other people get more back. And he starts the book, and the book is filled with examples, most of them from business of various types, but he starts the book with an anecdote about a politician. I won't tell the whole story, but about a politician who's running for election, and the election is very tight, and he realizes that if he stays in the election, there's a chance of his opponent winning, and his opponent is somebody whose values and beliefs are diametrically opposite to this man's. So he decides to pull out of the election, so somebody with a much smaller part of the electoral vote, he offers to support that man in order to defeat the candidate whose beliefs and values are really so antagonistic to his own. And that man, the politician who pulled out, ended up becoming President of the United States. His name is Abraham Lincoln. So that's the principle. I talked something about Washington's remarkable capacity for self-sacrifice and without asking anything in return as one of the principal reasons that he was elevated to the highest office. He's the only one everybody thought they could trust. Goodwill. I think one of the most difficult things, there are a lot of proverbs in all different countries about the goodwill. One of the most difficult things for people is to feel genuinely happy when something happens to another person. It's not quite so common. You know the anecdotes. In every country there are these anecdotes about out of jealousy, I don't mind losing one eye if my neighbor will lose two. That's the opposite side of this. I've been told it's an Indian story. I heard it in Russia as a Russian story, and I think it's a human story. But if you look in the literature or if you look in life, I believe there's no more powerful way to attract good to oneself than to really feel good and have goodwill for others. We already talked about humility. I quoted the example from Jim Collins' book, Good is Great, which is filled with scientific data on dozens of companies that the leaders, the most successful leaders, are those who are able to eliminate themselves. This is something I find very powerful. The truth is a reflection in the mirror. There's always a truth on the other side. Our tendency is we see the truth in our position and not in the other side. But to recognize that there's always another side and we're only seeing one side of the truth is a profound practical knowledge for accomplishment. Charles de Gaulle said, there is nothing that enhances authority more than silence. Carlyle said, silence is the element in which great things fashion themselves together, that at length they may emerge full-formed and majestic in the daylight of life, which they henceforth rule. One of the most difficult things to do sometimes is to be quiet, is to not speak. And the great speakers all know this, because the greatest speakers are the ones who know the power of the pause, the power of stopping, of leaving something unsaid, the power of leaving some space. And of course, the greatest music is only music because between the notes, there's a silence. In 1984, I published my first management book with a co-author, and we put this in the book as advice to business people because we studied what is the impact when a manager, an executive, tries to motivate other people to do work by telling them what to do. And one of the typical things we find is the more emphatically we tell somebody what to do, the more likelihood that we evoke a reaction or a resistance in the other person. And the more egoistically I assert what I want to do, the more the chances are that the other person will find a reason to prove that I'm wrong. So we wrote this, we talked to a lot of clients and advised them on this, and many have reported back finding it a very practically powerful result. In the course of the research for this book, my co-author, his name was Fred Harmon, we wanted to get an access to some of the big Fortune 500 companies for our research, and one of those companies was Sears Roebuck. And Fred happened to be in Chicago, and he called up the vice president of corporate communication, whose name also happened to be Harmon, and said, we've written to you, we've requested access for interviews in your company, so I'd like to come and meet you to discuss it. And the other Harmon said, well, you're welcome to come. I've already written to you saying that I don't think there's anything we can do, but I'm always interested to meet another man named Harmon, so come along. So Fred went and met this guy, Gene Harmon, I think was his name. And Gene, the vice president, started telling Fred why it's impossible for them to grant us interviews for this book. We wanted to go all the way up to the chairman of the company at that time, whose name was Brennan. And Fred just listened quietly. It's very clear that they had already made up their mind. And so he just listened quietly to the guy, and he said, it's going to cost too much money. Our people don't have time. We get so many opportunities. So many people want to interview us. If we want, we can get Fortune magazine in here. You guys are unknown. What are we going to do? And Fred just listened quietly. He never said a word. And after about 10 or 15 minutes of giving these arguments, the vice president stopped and he waited for Fred to say something in return, and Fred couldn't think of anything that was going to convince this guy, and he just kept quiet. And after 2 minutes of embarrassing silence, Gene Harmon, the vice president, said, of course it's true that books last a lot longer than magazine articles on the shelf. And if you really have a good book, it could be really a success story. And of course, for Sears to be in a book that really sells well, like In Search of Excellence, would be, of course, be a whole different story. Actually, you're not asking to meet that many people in the company. I mean, it's not that, and if you're a little flexible on the time. And for another 15 minutes, he was talking and Fred is listening. He hasn't said a word. And at the end of the time, he said, okay, Fred, I'm convinced we'll do it. And then he got up and led Fred to the door, and he said, you know, Fred, you're really a persuasive teacher. And Fred swears he never said anything except to smile and nod during the meeting. So when you're meeting resistance, try silent will. I've been in companies in a tight spot where it seemed like there was almost nothing they could do, and nothing they could do that would appear that was going to solve their problems and get them out of hot water. And the principle that I learned and I have been applying is, if there's nothing else you can do, if there's nothing you can do to solve your problem, do what you can do, even if it's 1% in the right direction. And from my practical experience, I've seen time and again that if you do all that you really can do positively, it creates new capacity and it creates new openings. And if you keep following that strategy, even a hopeless case like Chrysler Corporation, which Janani was talking about, can be turned around. And I've had a practical experience of doing this in a company which I really thought was a hopeless case. The example we have from this week is Steve Jobs. When Pixar seemed to be a total disaster case, a basket case that was going to close, he said, I can't sell more of these computers. There's no sense in producing them, but I've got this tiny little documentary computer-produced movie. Well, let me do that. And that turned out to be something 1,000 times bigger than the original business he had bought. That's the principle. This, to me, is one of the most profound lessons I have learned in life. The power of not reacting. Victor Hugo says he defines reaction, a boat which is going against the current, but which does not prevent the river from flowing on. You know what I mean by reaction? A situation comes, an impossible situation, somebody calls me tolerable, some lady captain comes and completely trespasses beyond her authority and wants me to do something outrageous she has no right to ask. If I react, I'm simply a boat going against the river. If I refuse to react, if I refuse to be disturbed by it, life tends to reverse. Life tends to reverse and come in the other direction. What you react to in others, you strengthen in yourself. Non-reaction to the ego in others is one of the most effective ways not only to go beyond ego in yourself, but also of dissolving the egoism in the situation. It's a very difficult thing to do, but if you ever have an impossible situation where somebody's giving you trouble and you don't know any other way to handle it, simply decide you're not going to react to what they do. Spirituality goes one further and says, not only don't react, don't take initiative. It's a quote from Lao Tzu. The foolish expend a great deal of energy and time trying to do everything and end up achieving nothing. On the other end of the spectrum, the truly wise don't seem to do much at all and yet achieve whatever they want. This magic is possible, indeed unavoidable, when one is in tune with the Tao and acts without attachment. Now, this is a wisdom from a few thousand years ago. I believe, I don't understand Taoism, I'm not a Taoist, but I believe this man knew something. I believe he saw something. I believe there was a truth in the fact that if you really tune in or in harmony with life, that if you're really in tune, even without acting, you will see life acting the way it brought Darcy back to Pemberley for Elizabeth. Our ego is constantly urging us to act, demanding that we act. And sometimes the capacity not to act is the most difficult thing we can do. Finally, I'd just like to end with something I call the complete act. Accomplishment is a question of doing something in order to get the results. Whether it's I'm making a meal for my family, it's a single act, or starting a company, or planning a trip, or whatever it is. We have acts of accomplishment at all different levels. Are there some essential criteria for a complete act? Are there some conditions under which an act will accomplish and achieve the maximum results? What I mean by a complete act is an act that generates the full results it's intended to achieve. And for that, I think there are three fundamental conditions for an act to really be complete. First of all, it's at the level of mind, at the level of knowledge. There's a knowledge necessary to do every act, whether it's cooking the food or whatever else, or planning, like Phileas Fogg did, a trip around the world in 80 days. When that knowledge is complete, when we have all the knowledge we need for that act, and equally important, when our decision about the act is complete. The problem that Darcy had is when he went to propose to Elizabeth, his mind wasn't made up. His heart was made up, but his mind was not invited. He said, I don't know why I should be doing this. I may be hurting myself by proposing to you. And he had the stupidity to actually tell her that. But anyway, he was caught in his own ambivalence. That's obviously not the formula for a complete act. We must be totally convinced, and taking decisions is a very hard thing. And to take a decision fully, how do we know that we've really taken the decision fully? When that decision releases our emotional enthusiasm. When the mind is totally convinced and totally decided, when it's saturated, it releases the endorsement of the emotions, the enthusiasm of the emotions, which generates the energy. That's the source of our psychological energy. The mind sets the direction. The heart, our emotions are really the source of the energy that drive our accomplishment. And finally, expressing that energy through skilled execution with positive attitudes. Now, you might say that this is that whole energy flow process that I showed you day before yesterday, I think it was, applied at the level of the individual act. Set the direction really clearly, be very clear, be very convinced, release the energy through the emotions, and then execute with the skill and only positive attitudes. And when those conditions are met, any act that I have seen or seen others do gives all the results and very many times more than the complete results that we expect from it. I'd like to just end by summing up what to me this course means, and I've gotten a tremendous amount out of it by interacting with you, by listening to the others, and just by thinking about it and preparing for it. You know, one of the things I've learned about education recently is the best education comes to those who try to teach others. And the real deficiency in our educational system is we've got one person standing up there in front of Berkeley. It was a few hundred for most of the classes. He's doing all the learning. We're getting the minimum as students because he's the one who's active. And that's why Alberto's calling and the consortium's calling, our learning must be active. We've got to get the student more and more involved. The students can be teaching each other. They can be teaching the faculty. But the real learning comes when we try to share what we know with others. So what I've gotten out of this, the bottom line, the takeaway for me of this course is that this thing we call an individual, which I don't think even now we've got our hands around fully or our minds around fully, is really a marvel. It's not a limited marvel. It's not a machine or a Rubik's Cube that we have to figure out the formulation for or something like that. It's not something limited in any way by mechanics or quantity. It's a creative center. It's something alive, creative, growing, and with infinite potential. And the thing that I got out of this is, I especially felt it this morning when I was listening to Alberto talking about the future of education. This technology we call education, if we can get it right, we can be advancing ourselves as a species. We can put ourselves hundreds of years ahead because there's so much, not information, it's not the scientific data we need to. If we take all that Alberto's told us about the psychology of being alive, about the social construction of knowledge, if we can give that as a basic skill to the youth all over the world, our problems of conflict with one another, our problems of conflict with nature, our problems of material want seem to be very small problems for us to solve. We look back now because we are much more cognizant of the past that we've come from than the future we're going to. We look back as if we're on the top of a big hill. Our GDP per capita has grown 12 times in 200 years, apart from our population. We've got all this fancy technology today that nobody had before. We're lucky in many ways. We've got more democracy and everything. We don't know where we're going in the future. But my feeling is that if we really learn something more about this thing we call individuality and how to culture our societies to bring it out in a most constructive way, not as every man for himself or woman for herself, but in a constructive, contributing way to the growth of the society, that we may look back in not too many decades as we would look from the top of that hill in Dubrovnik, looking down and say, my gosh, they were so low and that we have come so far since then. We've got a long way we can go and a lot to look forward to. Personally, it's been great being with all of you, and I thank you, particularly those of you who have come physically and shared yourself with us, and also all of you who are online, who have been patiently listening in and raising some really good, thought-provoking questions. And I know with the inconvenience of time change, time zone changes and everything, and sometimes our own delays in getting back to the meeting, on behalf of all the faculty of the behind this from the Academy and the Consortium, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for this meeting. Would anybody like to say anything further? We can wind up, we can continue, we can... Alberto, please.
Very good. Can you comment a little bit at the last point, that the power doesn't come from the outside, it lies within us. In my opinion, what we know scientifically, that power comes in the relationship, and especially in harmonic relationship with the outside inside, and so it's synergic.
I agree with that statement. Now the question is whether this statement can be reconciled with that statement. Whether there's a statement that's reconciled. I fully agree with you. I don't have any argument with that. And I think all that we've discussed this week is consistent with what you've said. What I'm trying to signify here is that we do have, the individual has an enormous untapped power. And if we release that power, we have the power to change those external circumstances. And the stories, that we've been looking at, the examples, are true to that. It's not like Churchill said, I'll do my part, and if everything else cooperates. He didn't say that. He said we will never surrender, and he went into his depths to be able to speak with that conviction. And when FDR said, go and put the money back in the bank, he didn't ask. He was not relying on. He was trying to inspire that capacity in other people. So I agree with what you've said.
And so would you agree, for example, also that yeah, it's true. I'm not uncomfortable with agreeing on one individual can change the world every time that he's in tune with the other human beings, and either the results can be positive or negative. One president of the Academy, Laswell, and others, Adorno, Wilhelm Reich, they wrote a beautiful book on the mass psychology of fascism, a book that earned him to be expelled from the German Communist Party, where he showed that, the character structure of dictators, but has to entwine, in tune, with the character structure of the populace. For example, if Hitler would have said all those things and people would laugh at him, he would not have changed the world of Germany at all. But it's like a relationship.
I 100% agree, and I think all our examples support what you say, that those who achieved the most did it by releasing what they had inside, but releasing the power. See, Churchill didn't do this single-handedly. He released the courage in the English people. Lincoln released the idealism in the American people to work for something higher. I fully agree with you. Fully agree. And that's a very important, maybe that's the ultimate message that we can take away from this.
There's a question on financial.
Ashok? Is that Ashok?
Yes.
Please go ahead. You've been a big help with your questions.
You said as part of your presentation that there is always a truth in the other person's point of view. That has made me a little curious. You see, as an ex-colony of Britain, India is only aware of all the ill treatment and mismanagement that as a colonial power that Britain inflicted on us. But the British on their part have boasted that they have civilized India. Can there be any truth in the British statement that they have civilized India if, in spite of all their ill treatment and mismanagement?
I repeat.
We are not aware of the positive side of their 150 years of rule. We are only aware of all the wrong things that they did. But they stubbornly claim that they civilized India. This in spite of the fact that the Britishers are not even known for taking regular baths, which is something Indian detests. Every Indian takes bath every day. But the British, they are not known to take regular baths, but they claim that they have civilized us.
I think the question is, you're going back to my statement that there's always a truth in the other person's point of view. And you're raising the example of, is there a truth in the British position that in coming to India, they civilized India? Indians may feel that Britain only kept them back. I think it's a very good question, worth exploration. Let's not go into specific statements because the British have said so many things about India and Indians have said so many things about Britain. But I think you'll agree with me, Ashok, you know the history very well, better than I do, that when the British came to India, they didn't come with the intention of colonizing India, that at least, whether you want to say 50%, or 30% or 70%, I leave to you and your further research. But we know the Indians were more concerned with competing with each other and getting power over each other than they were. They literally invited England in to take over the country. So the other side of the truth is, did England really come and conquer India? Or did India open itself up and welcome the help of foreigners for their own domestic competition? That's a question that can be answered, which shows there's another side to the story to saying that England came. You know, they never intended to have India as part of any government apparatus. You also know another fact, which is along the same lines, that when in 1904 Sri Aurobindo, as a political leader, tried to fight for Indian independence, you know that the biggest resistance came not from the British, it came from members of the elite in India who said, why would we want to be independent from England? How can we're the jewel in the crown. We're proud to be a part of the empire. We can't govern ourselves. We can't do as well as the British do here. So I think that clearly shows that there are two sides to it. There are two dimensions to it. This is not a one-sided, somebody came and took everything. Somebody also came. When they came, they were offered a lot, and they were welcomed. And my argument would be to this is that in a country of 300 million people, when there were only about 100,000 Englishmen there, by what possible power on earth could 100,000 Englishmen have kept 300 million Indians under their power if the 300 million Indians had decided they didn't want them and they wanted them to go? If nothing else, there was at least the complete acceptance and submission to foreign rule. And if that hadn't been there, that's the other side of the story. The British could have gone in 1904 if the Indians had really risen up and say, thank you for coming, but it's time to go, and we are not going to accept you here for one more day. No power on earth could have kept them in the country. So I think if you don't look at it literally in terms of one statement or other, if you look at it in terms of the life situation, you'll see there certainly is more than one side to the story. I'm not defending the British. I'm just saying it didn't just happen. There's more than one side to what happened.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashok, for all your questions, all your participation. You've really made me think more. And for all of you who have listened patiently, remotely. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank all the staff at Mother Service Society who work very, very hard behind the scenes for production of the materials, for coordination of the calls, for monitoring, recording, the website, the invitations, and everything that's gone into this. Thank you for doing a wonderful, flawless job.
I join you thanking the people of the Mother Service Society for this act of love, and thanks to them, we've been able to communicate with people around the world.
Thank you.